The moment erupts without warning. Kari Lake's voice slices through the chamber like broken glass. Shrill, unrelenting, each word hurled more like a weapon than a sentence. She jabs her finger into the air, her face flushed with fury, eyes darting around as if daring anyone to defy her. The crowd leans back instinctively, caught between shock and secondhand embarrassment. This isn't a debate anymore. It's a public meltdown broadcast in real time. Phones snap upward like a wave screen's glowing, recording every decibel of her rage. The sound ricochets across social feeds within seconds. Kari Lake screams, headlines blare. Clips hit. Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all at once. The caption writes itself. Kari Lake loses control. The room is no longer an audience, it's a jury. Some shift uncomfortably in their seats. Others smirk, sensing that history is about to pivot. But in the center of the storm sits Jasmine Crockett, hands folded, gaze steady, a study in composure. She doesn't flinch. She doesn't roll her eyes. She waits, as though she knows something the rest of the room does not. Lake's tirade grows. Louder, desperate, words colliding, until even her supporters look uneasy. Her voice strains, but it's not just volume, it's vulnerability. Behind the shouting, there's a hint of panic. Like a performer realizing the crowd has stopped clapping, and still Crockett waits. Every second of silence from her becomes a mirror, reflecting Lake's chaos back at her. Cameras catch it, one woman unraveling, another unmoved. The contrast is stark, undeniable, cinematic. The clip spreads like wildfire online. But the viral moment hasn't even arrived yet. The outburst is only the setup. The nation thinks it's seen the headline. But they haven't. Not yet. Because when Crockett finally opens her mouth, the room will change. The tone will shift. And what she says calmly, deliberately, without raising her voice, will eclipse. Lake screams in a way that no one watching will ever forget. The silence after her words will become louder than any outburst. Louder than Lake's fury, louder than the headlines themselves, and that silence is where the story truly begins. The clash didn't happen in a vacuum. It was born in a moment already thick with tension, where the air inside the hall felt heavier than the chandeliers above it. The stage had been set for what was supposed to be a forum on leadership and values, an evening where candidates would share visions of America's future. The room buzzed with anticipation, cameras from every major outlet positioned at every angle, live streams running nonstop. Voters at home tuned in expecting the usual back and forth. A little policy, a few sharp words, nothing new. What they got instead was something else entirely, because Kari Lake didn't arrive to debate. She arrived to dominate, to perform. Her campaign had been slipping, the headlines drifting away from her orbit, the spotlight dimming. And so she walked in with a mission to reclaim attention by any means necessary. Theatrics over thought. Volume over vision. Anger over answers. On the other side of the stage sat Jasmine Crockett, steady, deliberate, unshaken. Too many in that audience. She wasn't just another voice on the panel. She represented something larger, the face of resilience, the echo of communities too often silenced. Where Lake embodied chaos, Crockett stood for clarity. Where Lake lunged for spectacle, Crockett waited with patience. That contrast was not just personal, it was cultural. In that room, America saw its reflection, two paths diverging. One, a politics built on shouting, fear, and disruption. The other, a politics grounded in dignity, representation, and composure. This wasn't just about two women on a stage. It was about the future of public discourse itself. As Lake's shouting intensified, people at home leaned closer to their screens, not because they admired her fury, but because they sensed something more important was unfolding. Something bigger than an argument. It was as if the whole country was staring into a mirror, forced to decide which voice it wanted to echo louder in the years to come. Already, fragments of the exchange were bleeding into timelines. Clips were being shared with captions like, "This is embarrassing and she's lost it." But beneath the ridicule was something else. A hunger for the other side of the story. Everyone had seen the rage. What they were waiting for, desperately, was the response. And that is where Jasmine Crockett stepped into history. she didn't leap at the bait. She didn't match scream for scream. Instead, she let the silence hang, knowing the power of restraint. Viewers at home didn't just see her, they felt her. In that stillness, she embodied the frustration of millions who had watched chaos dominate political stages for too long. She became the voice of everyone who wanted a different America. That's why this moment mattered. Not because Kari Lake lost her temper, but because Crockett was about to show the nation what dignity looks like when it meets disorder face to face. The stakes weren't about policy points or applause lines. They were about proving that calm can be louder than chaos, that composure can win in an age addicted to noise. And when she finally spoke, the answer she delivered would not just silence Kari Lake. It would ripple far beyond that stage, into living rooms, onto timelines, across a country starved for something better. But Kari Lake's meltdown was only the beginning. Before Kari Lake was the face of political outrage, she was something else entirely. For decades, she sat behind a desk in front of bright studio lights, reading headlines with poise, voice steady, image carefully manicured. She was the kind of figure viewers trusted on instinct, polished, confident, framed by a professional smile that rarely slipped. The news was her stage, and she knew how to command it. Night after night, she delivered information in measured tones, presenting herself as the reliable presence in Arizona households. But behind that practiced professionalism was always a flicker of something else, an appetite for attention, a hunger for control. Even as she reported on the day's events, she studied the mechanics of performance. She knew the way a raised eyebrow could suggest outrage, the way a pause could signal gravity. She wasn't just a journalist. She was an actress rehearsing for a bigger role. When she stepped out of the newsroom and into politics, that flicker became a fire. The polished anchor transformed into a political agitator, weaponizing the same charisma that once calmed viewers. To now inflame them, no longer bound by scripts or teleprompters, Lake leaned into raw emotion. Her speeches were less about facts and more about force phrases sharpened like daggers, delivered with the same timing she had perfected on television. At first it worked. Crowds gathered, cheering as she railed against opponents with dramatic flair. She knew how to pause for applause, how to lift her chin just high enough to project authority. Supporters saw in her the confidence of someone who had already lived in their living rooms, someone familiar. The trust she had built as a news anchor became political capital. But charisma has its limits. As time went on, the polish began to crack. The contradictions grew harder to ignore. Here was a woman who once embodied journalistic neutrality now, slipping into venomous partisanship. Same calm voice that once delivered the weather now erupted into rants that seemed almost unhinged. Critics noticed. Headlines shifted. Clips of her shouting began to circulate moments when the volume overwhelmed the message. She developed a pattern. Whenever challenged, Lake raised her voice. Whenever pressed on details, she deflected with drama. Her followers mistook the noise for strength, but opponents saw something else. Insecurity masked by anger. She was, in many ways, addicted to volume. For her, silence felt like weakness. Attention-y kind of attention was fuel, and she would burn through it recklessly. Each outburst became more theatrical than the last. In interviews, she cut off questions with hostility. At rallies, she turned disagreements into spectacles. Clips of her shouting at reporters went viral, but not in the way she intended. Instead of commanding respect, she became the embodiment of chaos, a figure defined not by vision, but by volatility. Yet she kept doubling down. Rage became her brand. Her once polished image was replaced by one of constant confrontation. Leaned into it, convinced that sheer force could substitute for substance, that a raised voice could drown out inconvenient truths, she had always relied on volume. One commentator remarked, "But volume doesn't equal truth." And that was the paradox of Kari Lake. The skills that once elevated her a strong presence, a gift for performance, were now her undoing. Because in politics, unlike in television, the camera doesn't just capture the performance, it captures the cracks. The stage where she once thrived began to betray her. Every finger jab, every raised pitch, every moment of unrestrained anger was amplified, dissected, replayed endlessly. What once seemed powerful now looked desperate. The audiences she had once mesmerized were beginning to shift uncomfortably in their seats, and still she could not stop. The louder she became, the more she revealed. Beneath the shouting was not strength, but fear of irrelevance, fear of being challenged by voices she could not outshout. Which is why when she finally found herself face to face with Jasmine Crockett, she reached for the only tool she had ever trusted. Her voice sharpened into a scream.
Oh my God.
She believed it would work, as it always had. That sheer noise would overwhelm. Composure. The chaos would swallow calm. But what she didn't realize was that Crockett was not like her previous opponents. Crockett had built her life on weathering storms far greater than Lake's theatrics. For once, Lake's performance was not just unconvincing, it was self-defeating. And when she faced Crockett, her usual tactics backfired in ways she never expected. Before Jasmine Crockett's name trended across social media, before the headlines painted her as the calm voice that silenced chaos, she was simply a daughter of determination, raised in a world that demanded resilience. Her story was not written in golden ink or broadcast from polished studios. It was carved in grit, perseverance, and an unwavering sense of justice. Born into a working-class family, Crockett learned early what it meant to fight for dignity. Her parents instilled in her the values of hard work and integrity, teaching her that worth isn't measured by noise, but by character. She grew up watching loved ones stretch paychecks, neighbors struggle to be heard, and entire communities overlooked by those in power, while others might have become numb to that inequity. For Crockett, it sparked a lifelong flame. She excelled in school, not because success was handed to her, but because she refused to be ignored. Teachers often recalled the same thing: Jasmine's calm presence in the classroom. She wasn't the loudest voice, but when she spoke, people listened. It wasn't volume that made her stand out. It was clarity, conviction, and the quiet authority of someone who meant every word. When she pursued law, it wasn't for prestige or wealth, it was for purpose. She walked into courtrooms with the weight of her community on her shoulders, representing clients who could not afford the kind of attorneys her opponents brought to the table. She faced down systems designed to dismiss, to silence, to crush, and time after time, she stood her ground with a poise that unsettled even the most seasoned prosecutors. Crockett's advocacy stretched far beyond the courtroom. In neighborhoods overlooked by city planners, she listened. At rallies demanding equality, she marched. In legislative halls, she became a voice for those who rarely found a microphone in front of them. Unlike Kari Lake, whose voice often drowned others out, Crockett used hers to amplify. She understood that leadership wasn't about being the loudest person in the room. It was about ensuring everyone else was heard. Her calm strength wasn't passive. It was active, deliberate, and sharpened by experience. For every attack she endured as a woman of color in politics, for every insult hurled at her appearance or credentials, she carried herself with a dignity that turned insults into mirrors, reflecting more about her attackers than about her. Her silence in those moments was not weakness, it was strategy. She knew when to wait, when to listen, and when to deliver. A response that would cut deeper than any scream ever could. Community members often described her as someone who shows up. When storms flooded neighborhoods, Crockett was there with volunteers, rolling up her sleeves. When schools faced budget cuts, she was at the meetings, demanding answers. When young people doubted their place in a country that often questioned their worth, she reminded them, your existence is proof enough of your strength. She wasn't interested in fame, she was interested in impact. And yet fame found her anyway, precisely because of that authenticity. It was this authenticity that made her presence on that stage so powerful. She didn't need theatrics, didn't need to perform. Her story was her argument, her life was her credibility. And as Kari Lake raged and thundered, Crockett became the embodiment of something larger. the idea that composure itself was revolutionary. She had spent her life preparing for moments like this without ever seeking them. The courtroom battles taught her patience. The insults taught her resilience. The community taught her empathy. And all of it combined into a weapon Kari Lake never anticipated: quiet strength. The contrast could not have been more stark. Lake, with her background in polished news studios and her reliance on spectacle, believed that volume equaled power. Crockett, forged in the fires of lived struggle, understood that true power is not in noise, but in steadiness. In a world addicted to chaos, calm is disruption, and those qualities, her patience, her clarity, her refusal to be shaken, would soon become her greatest weapon. Because when Lake's voice cracked from shouting, when the room's energy bent, under the weight of disorder, it was Crockett's silence that held command. She knew that sometimes the most powerful move is to wait, to let the storm burn itself out, and then to step forward with words that echo longer than any scream. The night of the clash was no different. As Lake pounded the air with accusations, Crockett simply watched, her expression measured, her posture unbroken. People in the audience noticed. Viewers at home noticed. Even Lake noticed, though she would never admit it. The angrier she became, the more powerful Crockett's composure seemed, and when the time came, Crockett did not waste her breath on theatrics. She did not rise to Lake's level of noise. Instead, she lowered the temperature of the room with a reply so precise, so calm, that it made Lake's fury look almost cartoonish in comparison. Because when Lake exploded, Crockett did something no one saw coming. The storm did not pass, gathered. Kari Lake, already red-faced from her opening eruption, refused to release her grip on the stage. Each time a moderator attempted to move forward, Lake cut them off with another jab, her words dripping with mockery. She laughed at her own insults, smirking as though cruelty were cleverness. Her voice rising higher with each interruption. "Answer the question, Jasmine," she snapped, though Crockett had not even been given the chance to speak. "Or maybe you don't have one. Maybe all you can do is hide behind your fancy words and your fake dignity." The audience shifted uncomfortably. Some lowered their eyes, embarrassed by the spectacle. Others glanced toward Crockett, waiting to see if she would break. Even the moderators, trained to remain neutral, betrayed a flicker of unease. This wasn't debate, was derision. But Crockett did not flinch. She did not roll her eyes, did not mutter under her breath, did not take the bait. Instead, she listened, her hands still folded, her expression steady. Her silence became a force in itself, unnerving Kari more than any counterattack could. Lake's frustration mounted. She pointed across the stage, her gestures sharp and jagged. "See? Nothing. She's got nothing. She just sits there, like she's too good to answer." Well, let me tell you something. Jasmine, America doesn't need silence. America needs fighters. Yet the irony was plain. Lake equated shouting with fighting chaos with strength. But the crowd could see the cracks forming. Her voice wavered at the edges, the desperation in her tone louder than the insults themselves. In the quiet spaces Lake left between rants, the contrast became undeniable. On one side, a woman unraveling, thrashing louder with each passing second. On the other, a woman who refused to bend, whose calm presence made the chaos seem even smaller. The tension was unbearable. Like the pause before a glass finally shatters on the floor. Viewers at home tweeted furiously, clips of Lake's outbursts circulating in real time. But the anticipation was building towards something greater. Everyone was waiting, yearning for the moment when Crockett would finally respond. Lake sensed it too. She frantic, mocking Crockett's voice, mimicking her posture, desperate to draw her into the mud. But the more she tried, the more powerful Crockett's composure became. It was a paradox Lake could not solve. The silence was louder than her screams. The air inside the room felt thick, weighted by expectation. You could almost hear the collective heartbeat of the audience, waiting, straining for the moment when patience would turn to power. And then, with the nation watching, Crockett finally spoke. The room had been stretched to its breaking point. Like a drum pulled so tight, it was ready to snap. Kari Lake's voice still hung in the air, a shrill echo of accusation, but now it was swallowed by silence. All eyes shifted toward Jasmine Crockett. Cameras zoomed in. Phones steadied in hands, viewers knowing instinctively that history was about to happen. And then Crockett spoke. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't match fury with fury. Instead, her tone was low, calm, deliberate, each syllable carefully weighed, as though she understood that every word would be replayed 1,000,000 times before the night was over. "Kari," she began, her voice steady as stone, "I don't need to shout to be heard, and neither do the people I represent." Gasps rippled across the audience. The simplicity of the line hit harder than any insult could. Still leaning forward with her finger pointed, froze. Crockett had taken the very weapon Lake wielded, volume and disarmed it in a single breath. Crockett paused, letting the silence expand. That pause was not hesitation. It was command. She knew the power of a beat, the way anticipation could sharpen words before they landed. The audience leaned closer. Even the cameras seemed to lean in. "My community," she continued, her gaze unwavering, "has had to live with chaos for generations. We've seen it in our schools underfunded, in our families overpoliced, in our voices ignored. But through it all, we've learned something important. Calm is not weakness. Calm is strength, because chaos burns itself out. But dignity endures." The words hung in the air like a verdict. A murmur spread through the crowd, then fell quiet again as Crockett lifted her chin slightly, refusing to be rushed. "Kari, you confuse noise with leadership, but real leadership," she said, turning slightly toward the audience, "is not about who can scream the loudest. It's about who can stand firm when the screaming starts." A sharp intake of breath came. From somewhere in the front row, porters scribbled furiously. The moderators, caught between neutrality and awe, exchanged quick glances as though they too recognized the gravity of the moment. Lake tried to interject, her voice cracking on the first word. But Crockett held up a single hand, steady, calm, not aggressive, simply resolute. The gesture silenced the room more effectively than any gavel. "I don't have to perform anger to prove I care," Crockett said, her voice tightening just slightly for emphasis. "I prove I care by showing up for people, by listening when they speak, by making space for the voices that have been silenced. And that's why your shouting doesn't intimidate me, because I've seen louder storms than you, Kari, and I've outlasted them all." A gasp gave way to applause, tentative at first, then stronger, until it rolled through the chamber like a wave. The cameras caught it all. Kari Lake's face, tightening, her mouth opening as if to reply, but no words finding their way out. For the first time, it wasn't Lake driving the narrative. It was Crockett. She allowed the applause to crest, then raised her voice only slightly, not to shout but to resonate. "Let me be clear. People of this country are tired. Of chaos being passed off as courage, tired of anger being dressed up as authenticity. We are ready for something different. We're ready for leadership that listens instead of lectures, that builds instead of breaks." The audience erupted again. Hashtags were already forming in real time. Clips hit social media with captions like, "This is how you handle a bully in Crockett for president." Lake shifted in her seat, her earlier confidence draining. She attempted another interruption, something about Crockett dodging questions, but her voice faltered. The contrast was merciless. One woman unraveling in noise, the other standing tall in calm clarity. And Crockett wasn't finished. Leaned forward slightly, her tone dropping into the kind of steady cadence that anchors itself in memory. "Kari, if you think screaming makes you strong, you've misunderstood strength. True strength is being able to stand in the fire without becoming the fire. And that is what I will always choose. Calm dignity. And the truth." Silence followed. Not awkward, but reverent. The kind of silence that comes after a choir's final note, when no one dares to clap because they don't want to break the spell. And then, almost on cue, the room erupted. Applause, cheers, people on their feet. Moderators pounding their gavel for order, though no one was listening. Crockett's words had shifted the energy entirely. The debate was no longer about policy or posturing. It had become something bigger, A referendum on what kind of voice America wanted to follow. Lake slumped back, her usual arsenal useless. Her smirk looked brittle now, her hands twitching slightly as if searching for a defense. But there was none. She had brought a firestorm, and Crockett had smothered it with water. Not with force, but with composure. Not with anger, but with truth. Viewers at home tweeted furiously, some posting side-by-side clips, Lake mid-scream, face contorted, and Crockett calmly delivering her lines with steel in her eyes. The comparison needed no commentary. It was visual proof of a cultural shift. For Lake, it was humiliation. For Crockett, it was vindication. For the audience both, in the room and online, it was catharsis. Finally, someone had shown that it was possible to dismantle rage without becoming enraged. That dignity, when wielded deliberately, could be sharper than any insult. The debate was not over, but the balance of power had already shifted. Crockett had turned the stage into her arena. Her calm had dismantled chaos. Her silence had become thunder. Her words had become unforgettable. But the shockwaves didn't stop in that room. They spread across the entire nation. The roar of applause hadn't yet faded when the microphones went cold, but the ripple effect had already begun. Reporters scrambled out of their seats, phones raised, recording frantic voice memos. Producers barked into earpieces, demanding immediate clips for breaking news segments. Cameramen lingered on JasmineCrockett's.com, unwavering face, knowing it was the shot that would define the night. Outside the venue, audience members poured into the humid air, buzzing with energy, as though they had witnessed something historic. Some still clutched their programs, breathlessly recounting the moment word for word to strangers. Others stared at their phones, wide-eyed, as the clip spread across social media at lightning speed. Within minutes, hashtags began their climb. Hashtag.com wins. Hashtag Crockett mic drop. Hashtag volume ISNT truth. On TikTok, the video replayed in endless loops like mid-scream, fingers stabbing at the air, freeze-framed against Crockett's poised silence, followed by the line that cut like a blade. I don't need to shout to be heard. Creators layered dramatic music beneath it, slowed the clip, captioned it with fire emojis. By midnight, the edit had already been watched millions of times. Twitter lit up with side-by-side images, one of Lake, red-faced and raging, the other of Crockett, steady and serene. The captions practically wrote themselves: leadership versus loudership, strength versus noise. This is what America deserves. On. Instagram memes flourished. One showed a fire extinguisher labeled Crockett, aimed at a cartoon wildfire labeled Lake. Another simply read, when she said, "Calm is strength." I felt that. Even late-night comedians always hungry for viral fodder pounced on the exchange. By the time the sun rose, Crockett's delivery had already been immortalized in monologues across 3 networks, each replaying the clip to raucous laughter and applause. But beyond the humor, there was weight. Political analysts filled morning panels with sober expressions. This wasn't just a clapback, one commentator declared. This was a cultural reset. Lake represents a brand of politics fueled by volume and intimidation. Crockett showed that composure can dismantle chaos. That moment will be studied for years. Another added, it's more than viral theater. It reflects a yearning in the public. People are exhausted by outrage. They're hungry for someone who can meet the storm without becoming part of it. Across news outlets, the consensus was striking. What had begun as a shouting match had transformed into a referendum on leadership itself. Op-eds bloomed overnight, some praising Crockett as the embodiment of dignity in politics. Others noting how Lake's unraveling reflected the fragility of rage-based populism. And the people watching, they felt it. Comments poured in from teachers, nurses, immigrants, parents. Finally, someone said, "What we've been waiting to hear." I played that clip for my daughter. She saw what strength really looks like. I've been screamed at my whole life for being who I am. Watching Crockett stand calm against it, I cried. The viral tide didn't just elevate Crockett. It shifted the narrative of the event itself, what was supposed to be a standard. Debate became a cultural flashpoint. The organizers had expected fiery exchanges. What they got was a moment that redefined the stakes, leaving Kari Lake's camp scrambling to spin excuses. Lake herself appeared in interviews the next day, her voice strained, insisting that Crockett had dodged real issues and played theater for applause. But the damage was done. Every time she spoke, the networks cut to Crockett's composed reply, a side-by-side that rendered her protests hollow. The contrast was too stark, too clear. Meanwhile, Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't flood the airwaves. Instead, she released a single statement. Leadership is about listening. Last night I listened and then I answered. That's all. The humility only amplified the power of her performance. By week's end, the clip had reached the top of YouTube's trending page. Editorial cartoons appeared in national papers. A candle company even announced a limited edition.com as strength scent. The internet does what it always does, turns moments into movements, but beneath the humor and hashtags, there was something deeper pulsing through the culture. Because Crockett's words weren't just about Kari Lake, they tapped into something buried in the collective. American psyche, the exhaustion with noise, the hunger for dignity, the yearning for leaders who don't need to dominate a room to be heard. And that moral buried inside this viral moment reveals something much deeper about America today. When the dust settled, the headlines, the memes, and the late-night jokes all pointed toward a single truth. Calm will always outlast chaos. What Jasmine Crockett demonstrated in that heated moment was more than clever debating. It was a lesson about dignity, how silence can pierce louder than shouts, how composure can disarm the most relentless storm. In politics, it's easy to believe that volume equals victory. We've been conditioned to equate shouting with strength, interruptions with dominance, theatrics with leadership. But Crockett's reply exposed the emptiness of that model. Her calm was not weakness, it was resistance, a refusal to be dragged into the mud. And in that refusal, she revealed something many Americans have long craved. Proof that decency doesn't have to bow to chaos. The lesson transcends the debate stage. In workplaces, in classrooms, in homes across the country, people face their own versions of Kari Lake voices that intimidate, demean, or bully. Crockett's response became a symbol of how to endure those encounters, not by matching fury with fury, but by standing firm in truth, with composure as the shield. Her poise sent a message across every screen. You do not have to scream to be powerful, and that truth has historical weight. Time and again, progress has been shaped not just by those who spoke the loudest, but by those who stood the calmest. From civil rights marches to immigrant struggles, dignity in the face of rage has been a force more transformative than any shout. Crockett's moment may have been one debate, but it tapped into that deeper tradition, reminder that strength is not measured in decibels, but in conviction. For immigrants watching, for women of color who have endured being talked over, shouted down, or underestimated, Crockett's stance became a mirror. It said, "Your dignity is enough." For young people navigating a political culture of insults and division, it said, "There is another way." For everyday Americans, exhausted by the constant scream of the news cycle, it offered a breath of fresh air. Leadership doesn't need to be loud to be real. The story also offered a warning. Volume may dominate the moment, but it rarely survives the echo. Rage burns hot and burns out. Composure, like Crockett's, endures. The nation saw how quickly Lake's shouting dissolved into silence once met with calm truth. It was a lesson, not only for politicians, but for anyone who mistakes intimidation for influence. And so the debate became more than political theater. It became a parable, a reminder that in an age of endless noise, dignity is still revolutionary. That the ability to listen before speaking, to steady oneself before responding, is not weakness, is a rare form of courage. As Crockett walked off that stage, she didn't just leave behind a viral clip, she left behind a challenge. To every viewer who replayed her words, who saw themselves in her calm, carry it forward. In boardrooms, in classrooms, in communities divided by shouting matches. Remember what her silence and her composure proved: that truth does not need to scream. And that's why this story isn't just about Crockett versus Lake, it's about all of us, Kari Lake screamed. Jasmine Crockett stayed calm. And in the end, America decided whose voice was worth amplifying. The moment was more than a clash of personalities. It was a mirror held up to our democracy. Do we want to reward the noise, or do we want to uplift the dignity? That's the question this story leaves us with. Because every time a moment like this goes viral, it isn't just about the people on stage, it's about the kind of voices we as a nation choose to echo. Do we want the politics of chaos or the politics of composure? So I'll ask you directly. Which voice do you want to echo louder in our democracy? The shout that fades as soon as the camera's cut, or the calm that lingers, reshaping how we think, how we act, how we lead? If you believe stories like this matter, if you believe we need to keep highlighting dignity over disruption, then make sure you don't just watch. Be part of the echo. Subscribe to this channel. Share this video with someone who needs to see it, and join the conversation in the comments, because your voice matters here too. This isn't just about one debate stage. It's about what kind of politics we demand, what kind of leaders we honor, and what kind of future we build together. And if there's one lesson this moment has made undeniable, it's this: when dignity speaks, the world listens.